bands. They're like family, except you can fire them. And much like a family, they'll often keep on going long after the original members are gone. Southern rockers Lynyrd Skynyrd experienced one of the most famous tragedies in rock history in 1977, when a plane crash claimed the lives of singer Ronnie Van Sant, guitarist Steve Gaines, and his sister, backup vocalist Cassie Gaines. While that immense loss did halt the band for quite a while, it didn't mark the end of Lynyrd Skynyrd by a country rock mile. A decade later, Skynyrd's surviving members came together with Van Sant's younger brother Johnny on vocals and continued to tour for more than 35 years. Various members came and went in that time, but it wasn't until 2023 that the final bastion of original Skynyrd's legacy went away when founding guitarist Gary Rossington died. Rossington was ultimately replaced by another guitarist, and the band has continued to tour into 2026.
Gary wanted it to carry on. The last couple of years, he really didn't go out with us that much. He made special appearances.
Speaking with WDHA-FM, longtime Skynyrd guitarist Ricky Medlock explained that the public's response to Rossington's passing informed the group's difficult decision to keep going without any founding members. He reflected, "The one deciding factor was the fans always said, 'Please don't let this be the end of it.'" Quiet Riot burned very brightly for a very short period of time, but the band has a surprisingly deep history. According to Ultimate Classic Rock, Quiet Riot was originally founded all the way back in 1973 by guitarist Randy Rhoads, who would go on to superstardom with Ozzy Osbourne. The original lineup also included Drew Forsythe on drums and Kevin DuBrow as lead singer. This group managed 2 albums but didn't work well together, so that version of the band broke up in 1979 after Rhoads departed to play with Osbourne. Luckily for heavy metal fans, DuBrow reformed the band with drummer Frankie Banali, bassist Rudy Sarzo, and guitarist Carlos Cavasso, and even got Rhoads' blessing to keep using the name. The result was Metal Health, the band's biggest and best-known album. That means that as far back as 1982, DuBrow was the last original member in the band. They went through several more incarnations over the years, but after DuBrow passed away in 2007, the band working under the name Quiet Riot has only a thin connection to the original band. There was a time when Foreigner absolutely dominated the pop and rock charts. In fact, it was an impressively long period. Between 1977 and 1990, the band logged 22 songs in the top 100, with 9 in the top 10. And a #1 smash in the form of I Want to Know What Love Is in 1984. I wanna know what love is. They also released 6 top 10 albums, including 4, which hit #1 in 1981. Then in 1989, lead singer Lou Gramm left the group. Instead of breaking up, Foreigner hired a new singer, Johnny Edwards, and released an album without Gramm. Although Gramm returned in 1992, a precedent had already been set. When Gramm left again in 2003, founder and lead guitarist Mick Jones hired another new singer, Kelly Hansen, and soldiered on. Fast forward to 2023, and Mick Jones is now the only original member still associated with Foreigner, though not all the time. While he's officially still in the band and still performs with them, he doesn't always show up. In fact, when the band toured Israel in 2018, he was too ill to join them, so that entire tour lacked original members. Jones's final performance with the band was in 2022 during the band's historic farewell tour. Formed in 1968 by John Anderson, Chris Squire, Peter Banks, Tony Kaye, and Bill Bruford, Yes is one of those groups that has actually been several different bands over the course of its history, with each version of the band featuring new lineups. In fact, there have been nearly 20 musicians in Yes at some point during the band's history. But since Squire's death in 2015, there are no original members in it at all. That doesn't mean that the current version of the band is completely divorced from the progressive rock legends who gave us songs like Long Distance Runaround and Then, or the more pop-oriented 1980s version of the band. Current member Steve Howe's involvement dates back to 1970, and Alan White first joined in 1972. One element of confusion with Yes is the fact that almost all of their best-known songs were sung by John Anderson, whose distinctly high-pitched voice and new age lyrics helped define the band's sound. Anderson is still alive and active. He was part of a group called Anderson, Rabin, and Wakeman, which featured 2 other former Yes members. They were legally prevented from using the name Yes, but performed Yes songs in concerts until their breakup in 2020. When you think of Heart, you think of the Wilson sisters, Anne with the impossibly huge voice and Nancy with the shredding guitar licks. But neither Wilson sister is an original member of Heart, although they took over almost immediately after they joined.
The attention was always focused on the 2 of us, because I guess we're just the most obvious thing to focus on.
Heart's history goes back to 1967, when guitarist Roger Fisher and bassist Steve Fossen formed a band called The Army. Over the next few years, the band's name and lineup changed frequently, at one point becoming Whiteheart. In the early 1970s, Ann Wilson joined the band, and the name changed to Hocus Pocus. Nancy joined shortly after, and they became Heart once and for all. By the time that classic 1970s lineup saw their big break with the release of Dreamboat Annie, it was a very different band from the one Fisher and Fossen had founded. Heart remained a force throughout the 70s, but by the early 80s they'd run out of steam. Fisher left in 1979 and Fossen departed in 1982, leaving no original members in the band. The Wilsons set about reinventing Heart, transforming it into an 80s hard rock outfit. They released the ultimate comeback album, 1985's Heart, without a single founding member's contribution. Blood, Sweat and Tears was formed in 1967 by Al Kooper, Jim Fielder, Fred Lipsius, Randy Brecker, Jerry Weiss, Dick Halligan, Steve Katz, and Bobby Columbi. You might think that with that many founding members, some of them must have stuck around, but you'd be almost totally wrong. Led by Kooper, the band quickly got to work recording songs that were unusual for rock and roll. Simply having a full-on horn section set the band apart from everyone else. In 1968, they released their first album, Child is Father to the Man, to moderate success.
If I ever leave you.
But the band fell apart almost immediately due to simmering tensions between members. Kooper, Brecker, and Weiss left before work on their second album had even started. Since then, almost 200 people have officially performed with Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Over the course of those lineup changes and legal battles, all of the original members exited and were replaced, then replaced again. The one thread holding everything together is Columbi, who still owns the band name and music rights. Technically, Columbi isn't in the band anymore, though. He manages and produces, hiring musicians as needed. Named in honor of rock and roll legend Buddy Holly, the Hollies were formed in England in 1962 by Alan Clark and Graham Nash. They eventually added Tony Hicks, Bobby Elliott, and Bernie Calvert to form the lineup that gave us classic hits like Bus Stop.
Bus stop where they choose there, I say, fish in my umbrella.
The Hollies are often considered criminally underrated as a 1960s band. As author Peter Doggett points out, they were huge superstars in England and probably second only to the Beatles in terms of hit songs and influence.
I first met the Beatles on November the 19th in 1959.
Wow.
They weren't even called the Beatles.
After years of success, Nash and Clark began having creative differences, which came to a head when the band rejected Nash's song Marrakesh Express. Nash left in 1968 to form a little band called Crosby, Stills and Nash. Clark wanted a solo career and left in 1971, only to rejoin in 1973 when a song he'd co-written for the Hollies, Long Cool Woman in a Black Dress, became a huge international hit. Classics du jour notes that Clark didn't just leave the Hollies again in 1999, he retired from music altogether. The band today is led by Hicks and Elliott, who are very, very close to being original members, but not quite. The concept of a supergroup was a novel idea in the 1960s when Small Faces guitarist Steve Marriott brought together bassist Greg Ridley of the band Spooky Tooth, Peter Frampton from The Herd, and teenage drumming phenomenon Jerry Shirley to form Humble Pie. Considered one of the first supergroups, the band had a string of hit songs, including the timeless classic 30 Days in the Hole. Frampton left in 1971 and would eventually release one of the most successful live albums of all time. The band continued until 1975, was reformed by Marriott and Shirley in 1979, then fell apart again in the early 80s. Shirley secured the rights to the name Humble Pie in 1989 and started it again. There was some hope that Marriott and Frampton might rejoin, but that dream ended after Marriott died tragically in a fire at his home in 1991. These days, you can still go to a Humble Pie concert, but you won't see any original members. Drummer Shirley still owns the name and manages the band, but he doesn't tour with them. You would probably instantly recognize Canned Heat's most famous song. Going Up the Country is a staple of classic rock playlists, movie soundtracks, and commercials. Canned Heat was formed in 1965 by Alan Wilson and Bob Haidt, who were huge fans of American blues music. From the very beginning, the band's lineup was in flux, but appearances at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967 and their iconic performance at Woodstock in 1969 made them superstars. Sadly, Wilson died of a drug overdose in 1970. The band powered on with Haidt until 1981, when he also died of a drug overdose. Canned Heat never broke up. It just keeps hiring new members and plugging on. It's currently anchored by drummer Adolfo Fito de la Parra, whose tenure with the band dates back to 1967. Judas Priest are legends of heavy metal, with songs like Livin' After Midnight and Breaking the Law that are considered classics of the genre.
Breaking the law, breaking the law.
While the band is still going strong, it has exactly 0 original members. This isn't surprising, since it hasn't had any original members for the vast majority of its existence. Judas Priest was formed in 1969 by lead vocalist Al Atkins, bassist Brian Stapenhill, guitarist John Perry, and drummer John Partridge. They were originally a blues rock band with an entirely different sound. In fact, according to author Neil Daniels, guitarist KK Downing, who came to define the band's sound along with eventual lead singer Rob Halford, auditioned for the band and was rejected by Atkins. The group broke up in the early 1970s, and Atkins joined a band called Freight, featuring Downing on lead guitar, which took on the Judas Priest name. But by 1973, still before the band even recorded their first album, the only original member left was Atkins, though the lack of success convinced him to quit. Halford joined, setting the stage for the band's most successful period as their sound evolved into harder rock. From that point on, not a single founding member has had anything to do with Judas Priest. In the annals of one-hit wonders, there's a special place for Iron Butterfly. Founded in 1966 by Doug Ingle, Jack Penny, Greg Willis, and Danny Wise, the band is famous for exactly one nearly endless song, the extremely 1960s 17-plus minute long In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. But that song is so iconic and instantly recognizable that it's provided a living for the band since its release in 1968. And the number of people who've made their living off of that one song at some point during the last 50-plus years is pretty substantial. More than 65 musicians have been official members over the years. The band started a revolving door of members almost immediately. They broke up in 1971, but reformed in various incarnations over the years as In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida racked up tens of millions of sales. Iron Butterfly reformed with Ingle and Ron Bushy, who joined a few months after its founding. Ingle retired in the late 90s, leaving Bushy in charge of the group. Iron Butterfly is essentially a tribute band at this point, though Bushy almost counts as an original member. Sometimes bands bring in musicians to fill gaps, then one of these new players slowly takes over. That's what happened with one of the first Australian bands to crack the American market, the Little River Band.
Have you heard about the Lonesome Loser?
The Little River Band, formed in 1975, is a bit of a supergroup in its native Australia. As founding members Beeb Birtles, Graham Davidge, Graham Goebel, Derek Pellicci, and Glenn Sharrock were all pretty established performers in their home country. The band enjoyed almost immediate success with their first album and ended the 1970s as one of the biggest selling groups around. The 80s weren't so kind, however. Wayne Nelson joined in 1980 as a new bassist and sang lead on one song.
Must be the gypsy in their soul.
The band went through a prolonged period of mutation. Sharrock, Birtles, Goebel, and Pellicci all left at some point. The original members continued to shuffle in and out of the lineup until 1998, when they all, more or less, permanently left. Wayne Nelson took over lead singing duties and today pretty much runs the band. The current lineup features musicians who only date back to 2004 at the earliest. Unless you're into grindcore metal, you might not know much about Napalm Death, but within the heavy metal community, this band is legendary. They've also been around for 40 years, originating in 1981. Well, a band called Napalm Death was founded in 1981. None of the current members were there at the time. Napalm Death was launched by Nick Bullen and Miles Ratledge, who brought in guitarist Simon Oppenheimer. After a few years of personnel changes, demo recordings, and live shows, Bullen and Ratledge began to evolve in different musical directions. Bullen's frustrations continued until he quit in 1986, just after recording a final demo that became the first side of their first official album, Scum, released in 1987. The lineup has been steady ever since, but the fact is this band's most well-known lineup only solidified after the original members were gone. Southern rock band Blackfoot has had an extremely complicated history. Originally formed in 1969 with Ricky Medlock, Greg T. Walker, Charlie Hargret, and Jackson Spires, the group chose their name to honor the Native American heritage many of the members shared. But before the group could really gain any traction, Medlock was asked to join Lynyrd Skynyrd, and he didn't hesitate for a second, so Blackfoot was put on hold for a few years. The four original Blackfoot members reformed the group in 1974 and finally released their first album, No Reservations, in September 1975. This kicked off a stable and successful period for the band, during which they released their signature songs Highway Song and Train Train. Blackfoot's fortunes turned for the worse in the following decades as they broke up in 1986. A new lineup released the 1987 album Rick Medlock and Blackfoot, which aimed for a more modern sound. Eventually, Medlock was once again invited to join Lynyrd Skynyrd and once again left Blackfoot without a second thought. Today, the other founding members of the band have moved on, while Spires died in 2005. Medlock rebooted the band in 2012 and again in 2021, with himself as manager and producer and hired hands playing the instruments. And apparently, the other founding members aren't happy about the decision. It's essentially a totally different band with a sound the founding members wouldn't recognize. Formed by childhood friends Brian Downey and Phil Lynott in 1969, Irish rock band Thin Lizzy established themselves as one of the most ferocious groups in the world in the 70s. Their twin guitar sound peaked with the release of their 1976 album Jailbreak, which featured their signature song The Boys Are Back in Town. But by the early 80s, the band was struggling. Between the changing sound of pop music and Lynott's growing heroin addiction, the band simply couldn't survive, and they broke up in 1983. Lynott passed away in 1986, and then Downey put together a new lineup in the mid-90s, but then he eventually left the band himself in 2013. This left Thin Lizzy with 0 original members, though current guitarist Scott Gorham joined back in 1974 and played on their most successful albums. After Downey left the band, Gorham formed Black Star Riders as a way to create original music that was distinct from Thin Lizzy, though he left that group in 2021 to concentrate on Thin Lizzy. Known for wearing outrageous latex costumes and adopting stage names like Odorous Urungus and Techno Destructo, GWAR has certainly been one of a kind since their formation in 1984. You might wonder if you're supposed to take them seriously, but GWAR was always meant to be a form of performance art that melded heavy metal with a sense of the absurd. Making things even more complex is the ever-changing lineup of the band, with more than 36 performers having been a part of GWAR at one point or another. All that turnover means it's not too surprising that there are no longer any original members in the band at all. That's been the case since the 2014 death of Dave Brockie, aka Odorous Urungus. Although it's worth noting that current vocalist and occasional bassist Mike Bishop, while not technically a founding member, did play on the group's 1988 debut Hello. How much all this matters is an open question, since various members of GWAR are hidden behind ludicrous costumes and frequently cycle in and out of the band, you might not even know who's playing on stage anyway if you catch one of their shows. All that's guaranteed is that it won't be any of the original members.
That's narrowed it down considerably.
Molly Hatchet were never the biggest band in the world, but they were nevertheless very influential in the southern rock genre. They were pretty successful at the height of their fame, releasing multiple platinum albums, including 1979's Flirtin' with Disaster, which hit number 19 on the Billboard charts and has sold more than 2 million copies. If all that makes you excited to see Molly Hatchet in concert, you're in luck, as the band is still on the road regularly. But you should know that you won't be seeing a single original member on the stage, as the last living one of them, guitarist Steve Holland, passed away in 2020. But Holland had already left the band decades earlier in 1984, so it was actually in 2017 when founding guitarist Dave Lubick passed away that Molly Hatchet entered its era of 0 original members. In the early days of the band, Holland and Lubick were soon joined by vocalist Danny Joe Brown, guitarist Dwayne Rowland, bassist Banner Thomas, and drummer Bruce Crump, who have also all since passed away. That means there's no possibility of ever seeing Molly Hatchet in its true form ever again. The longest-serving member in the current lineup is guitarist Bobby Ingram, who joined the band in 1987.
There's an ocean of sorrow in you.
Swedish band Opeth may not exactly be a household name, but they've had a significant impact on the genre of progressive metal. They have their origins in death metal, but they evolved to include intricate arrangements and a surprisingly wide variety of instrumentation. And they've been fairly successful at it, with 4 albums landing in the top 40 on the Billboard 200 albums chart. Opeth have also embraced a wide variety of band members. In fact, they haven't had an original member since 1992, just 2 years after their founding. At the band's very beginning in 1990, lead singer David Isberg invited Michael Okerfeldt to be the new bassist without telling the current bassist or any of the other members. A fight broke out about it and every other member left the group. Isberg and Okerfeldt forged ahead, but the next few years were also tumultuous. The band added and lost 6 different members until 1992, when Isberg himself left and Okerfeldt took over singing duties. Opeth eventually released their debut album Orchid in 1995, and they've been going strong ever since, with Okerfeldt as the only consistent member.
Yeah, it's that guy. It's Michael from Opeth.
If you were alive and rockin' in the mid-'80s, you probably remember the glam band Autograph and their one big hit song, Turn Up the Radio. And if you're still paying attention to them, you might have noticed they released an album called Beyond in November of 2022. But if you catch the band on tour in support of that album, you won't get to see any of the original members. Unfortunately, founding bassist Randy Rand, who was the last original active member, passed away in April 2022. Autograph broke up in 1989 and then reformed in 2013 with original members Rand, Steve Lynch, and Kenny Richards, the latter of whom passed away in 2017. That incarnation released 2 new albums, but then Lynch left the band again in 2019. After Rand's death, the band kept going without any original members, and then a legal fight broke out between Lynch and the current lineup over ownership of the band's name and trademark. Lynch claims that the band is contractually obligated to have at least one original member to be able to use the name Autograph. As far as he's concerned, the current iteration is now more of a tribute band than the real thing, and is only in it for the money. The Drifters were formed way back in 1953, and they remain one of the most famous bands of the era. Even if you're not a huge fan of doo-wop, you may very well know some of their iconic songs, like There Goes My Baby, On Broadway, or Under the Boardwalk. And you can still hear the Drifters perform those classics on stage, as long as you don't mind the fact that they haven't included any original members since 1954. Clyde McPhatter formed the Drifters in 1953 at the urging of the legendary Amit Ertegun, co-founder of Atlantic Records. By the time McPhatter left the following year after doing some recording with the group, things got complicated as he sold his half of the group to his manager, George Treadwell. Treadwell then recruited a band called the Five Crowns to become the new Drifters. More lineup changes ensued, with at least 20 different singers recording songs for the Drifters in their heyday. By the early 21st century, as many as a dozen groups were touring simultaneously under the name. Some included members from an official version of the band, but none with a truly original member. That would be impossible anyway, since the last remaining original, Bill Pinkney, passed away in 2007. Considering that the history of the Oak Ridge Boys dates all the way back to 1943, it's not too surprising that no original members remain in the group. In that year, gospel music legend Wally Fowler founded a group called the Georgia Clodhoppers in Knoxville, Tennessee. The name was changed to the Oak Ridge Quartet a few years later, and then they disbanded in the early 50s. Fowler eventually sold the rights to the group in 1957. The band continued to perform, sometimes calling themselves the Oak Ridge Boys, and the name change became permanent in 1966. Throughout the 1960s, the band concentrated on Southern gospel music, but by the 70s, they crossed over into the mainstream country scene. They scored their biggest hit in 1981 with a cover of Elvira, which was originally recorded by Dallas Frazier in 1966. While the Oak Ridge Boys continued to record albums and tour, the longest-serving member of the band, William Lee Golden, only joined the group in 1965. By that point, the group's history already stretched back more than 20 years. Dwayne Allen joined the next year, while Richard Sturban joined in 1972, and then Joe Bonzall arrived in 1973. While these 4 musicians make up what most people would think of as the iconic Oak Ridge Boys lineup and have been together for decades, none of them were technically there in the beginning. British prog rock band Soft Machine was formed in 1966 by drummer-vocalist Robert Wyatt, bassist Kevin Ayers, guitarist David Allen, and organist Mike Ratledge. Almost instantly, its revolving door of band members began to turn. Allen exited in 1967 and was shortly thereafter replaced by Future Police guitarist Andy Summers. Summers was fired in 1968 by Ayers, who wound up quitting that same year. While the band effectively broke up after that, they ultimately had to record another album to honor a contract. So Wyatt and Ratledge brought in road manager Hugh Hopper on bass and tracked another record. Wyatt then cut ties with the band in 1971, leaving Ratledge as the last original member. He continued working with the shifting lineup for several years, but ultimately left the project while recording the band's 1976 record Softs. The band has continued in various formations ever since, and the ever-changing lineup has become an essential piece to the project's legacy. As current band member Theo Travis reflected to The Guardian, Each chapter in Soft Machine's history is almost like a different band, but with this thread going through it. I personally like to keep it artistically ambitious and forward-looking, but at the same time respecting this amazing history. As of 2025, guitarist John Etheridge was the longest-standing fixture in the band, having joined in the mid-70s. The Spinners came together in 1954 as a quintet of R&B singers known as the Domingos. Though they soon changed their name, the lineup remained Henry Fambrough, Billy Henderson, Purvis Jackson, Bobby Smith, and Felipe Wynne for several decades. It was under that legendary banner that the group churned out hit after hit, including the Rubber Band Man. And I'll Be Around. Then came You, their 1974 collab with Dionne Warwick even hit #1 on the Billboard charts, and it wasn't long after that that the band's lineup began to shift. Wynne was the first to go after his attempt to rename the band Felipe Wynne and the Spinners was met with resistance from the other members. He ultimately left in 1977 to be replaced by John Edwards. Sadly, just 7 years later, Wynne died of a heart attack. In 2004, Henderson was fired after suing the group's business manager in an attempt to access the band's financial records. He died 3 years later at the age of 67. The following year, Jackson also passed on at the age of 70. Smith and Fambrough went on to bring new singers into the mix and continued performing as the Spinners until Smith died in 2013. Fambrough, the last surviving original member, spent another decade with the group before retiring in 2023. He died the following year. As of early 2026, the Spinners, now made up of Jesse Peck, Keith Patterson, Ronnie Moss, and CJ Jefferson, continued to tour. With over 250 albums worth of recorded music, instrumental surf rockers The Ventures may be the most prolific band in rock history. The first guitar-driven hit, Walk Don't Run, dates back to 1960, and founding guitarists Don Wilson and Bob Bogle remained with the band for decades after its release. The two remained the only constants amid a shifting lineup until Bogle retired in 2005. 4 years later, he died at 75. Bogle was then replaced by Bob Spalding, and Wilson continued to lead the new lineup until he retired in 2015. At that point, Spalding took over as the Ventures' de facto leader, and his son Ian took over Wilson's guitar duties. Though they continued performing as the Ventures, even the band's former tour manager questioned the validity of that call. As he told ClassicBands.com in 2020, "I guess they're paying some royalty to use the Ventures' name, but again, it doesn't matter. They're not the Ventures." Wilson, who reportedly authorized Spalding's use of the name, ultimately died in 2022, and the band stopped touring the following year. While they never made an official announcement that they were disbanding, a contributor to the Surf Guitar 101 forum claimed that a reliable source revealed the band had broken up after a licensing firm that had purchased the rights to the Ventures' name refused to renew the remaining members' permission to use it. Admittedly, that may make the Ventures' place on this list somewhat questionable, but given that they did tour for the better part of a decade without Bogle or Wilson, we'll let it slide. The Four Freshmen Jazz Quartet first formed in 1948, consisting of brothers Don and Ross Barber, cousin Bob Flanagan, and their friend Hal Crotched. It didn't take long for the group to find some degree of success, and it didn't take much longer for its founders to move on with their lives. They first charted in 1952 with the track It's a Blue World.
It's a blue world.
By the following year, Crotched was already married and sick of touring. After he left, he was replaced by Ken Air, who left a year later. Don Barber was killed in a 1961 car crash while his brother retired in 1977. Flanagan stuck it out with the group the longest, remaining a mainstay until he too retired in 1992. Both Flanagan and Barber passed away in 2011. These days, the Four Freshmen is made up of Bob Ferreira, Jake Baldwin, Tommy Boyton, and the newest arrival, Chris Peters, who joined in 2025. The group remains active and already has shows booked late into 2026. Speaking to the Toledo Blade about the group's legacy, Ferreira commented, "We've kind of equated it to being on a sports team. The organization stays the same, but the players have changed over the years. People say, we saw the original group, but the original group was no longer the original group in 1953 when Crotched left." Over the better part of a century, the Four Freshmen have released over 50 albums and received 6 Grammy nominations. But possibly their most influential contribution to modern music wasn't even something they did on purpose. Beach Boys visionary Brian Wilson often credited the band as one of his greatest inspirations.
I got in so into the Freshmen that like I almost became the Freshman.
Founded in 1953, the Four Tops delivered soul-tinged hit after soul-tinged hit, and tracks like Reach Out, I'll Be There, I Can't Help Myself, Sugar Pie Honey Bunch, and Baby I Need Your Loving still get played on the radio to this day. Unlike a lot of bands on this list, the Four Tops made it the better part of 50 years without losing a member. The original roster of Levi Stubbs, Duke Bakir, Ronaldo Obi Benson, and Lawrence Payton remained intact all the way until Payton's passing in 1997. For a time, the group continued as a three-piece, appropriately shortening their name to the Tops, until Theo Peoples stepped in to fill the void. Stubbs was the next member to leave the project after suffering a stroke in 2000. He died 8 years later at age 72. Peoples took over for Stubbs on lead vocals, and Ronnie McNear stepped in to fill Peoples' position. Benson ultimately died of lung cancer in 2005, and Payton's son, Raquel, stepped up to complete the lineup. With Fakir as the last original member, the group continued until he too retired in 2024. Just months later, he passed away at the age of 88. He was replaced by Michael Brock, who joined Payton, Peoples, and McNear in the now completely new lineup. The group has plans to tour well into 2026. There are a few versions of the Grassroots lineup you might call the original, but neither of them lasted particularly long. The group was first conceptualized in 1965 by producer Lou Adler, who brought together songwriters Steve Barry and P.F. Sloan to write and record a single. With the help of some studio musicians, the pair wrote and recorded the track Where Were You When I Needed You? When it became a hit, Adler decided to put a face to his manufactured band. Unfortunately, the first group of musicians he hired got fed up with the deal so quickly that by 1967 he had to completely replace them. Those replacements were Rob Grill on lead vocals and bass, drummer Rick Kuntz, and guitarist Warren Ettner and Creed Bratton. And before you ask, yes, that is the same Creed Bratton from The Office. Arguably, this is the lineup most widely associated with the Grassroots name. Barry, Sloan, Bratton, Entner, Grill, and Kuntz all contributed to the writing and recording of the 1967 album Let's Live for Today. It wasn't long after that Sloan ended up leaving, reportedly getting fed up with the label's poor treatment of the band. Grill, Kuntz, Ettner, and Bratton continued to write and perform as the Grassroots, but Barry ultimately pivoted from writing songs to producing. Throughout the late 60s and early 70s, band members began to come and go, and by 1974, Grill was the sole member anyone could even argue was original. He too eventually left to go solo. In the early 1980s, he revived the Grassroots with yet another lineup and remained active in the group until his death in 2011. The band continued on without him and remains a popular oldies act.